To introduce the panel, starting from the far side, they are Charles Bonini, the William R. Timken Professor of Management Science, Emeritus, William Sharpe, the Stanco 25 Professor of Finance, Emeritus, James Miller III, the Walter and Elise Haas Professor of Business Administration, Emeritus, and our moderator, Jeffrey Moore, Senior Lecturer in Operations and Information Technology, retired, and former Assistant Dean for Computing. In addition to our panel, I'd like to thank some other people who made this program possible today: Media Services, the GSB Library, Lifelong Learning, and Alumni Relations. The last part of our session will be reserved for a Q&A. Feel free to use the question forms, which I will collect before the Q&A session begins. This event is being live streamed, and we intend to load it up on YouTube. And now, let's welcome our distinguished panel.
Thank you. One of the characteristics of early use of computers is that there was no computer science programs. And so virtually all of us came from other disciplines. And we're going to make an announcement. I'm sure it'll come as a surprise to him. But in effect, we're going to bring one of the panelists out of the closet. He has been rewarded for his contributions in finance. And we know all about the capital asset pricing model and portfolio optimization and so on. But the truth is that we panel members know he is not a finance specialist. It's his avocation. At heart, he's a computer nerd. And for that, I am going to offer some evidence. This is the Bible that I used in my doctoral program, written by William Sharpe, and it was one of the first books that focused on the economics of computers. It's remarkable for several reasons. First, you see the hollerith punch card, which was the norm at the time. But what's really quite remarkable for a 700-page book is the list price was $10. I bought it discounted for $8. So even adjusting for inflation, we got a bargain from him.
I made it up on volume. We sold 100.
Let me give you a bit of an overview. What we're going to talk about is focusing on the teaching and research aspects. The administrative uses of computers will be the topic of a future panel. We're going to cover decades. We're going to emphasize the early decades, probably shortchanging because of time the most recent decades. First, you have to adjust your historical perspective because it takes some work to look backward that far. There's been 40 years of Moore's Law. There's actually a Jeffrey Moore law, but it didn't make the cut. So we're talking Gordon Moore's law. And it's roughly 40 years, which is 20 doublings. And he postulated that the density doubles every 2 years. So we're talking about 20 doublings or a million-fold increase in the density of silicon, and similar increases, although not as dramatic, in computer communications and magnetic memory and the like. We're going to give you some cost numbers, and so to kind of convert those to today's dollars, roughly multiply by 5 to adjust for the CPI over this interval. The other thing you have to keep in mind is that when a teenager learns to drive, they've spent almost 2 decades of their lives learning about streets and cities and traffic laws and so on long before they sit behind the wheel. We were faced with the problem of introducing computers to MBA students, many of which had never seen a computer, much less used it, so they had unrealistic expectations because they had just seen the movie 2001 by Kubrick, in which an artificially intelligent computer becomes psychotic. And so they would often have unrealistic expectations that we need to adjust for. Here are some quotes of the the past that you might find quite interesting. The thing to notice is that all three authors were high-tech people. This is, you can see the negative attitude, even from the IT industry, concerning the advent, particularly of personal computers in the 1970s and 1980s. In my own case, although I started out teaching management of IT, I also migrated into teaching of the modeling course. And while it was never a total failure, lots of students had open minds, it certainly anchored the bottom of the distribution of course evaluations. I've recorded 3 that I remember even today, we're going back now 40 years, of the written comments. This was not representative, but it only takes, as anyone who teaches here at the GSB, it only takes a few disgruntled students to destroy your reputation. And so here are a few of the comments that I got back from the students from teaching the course. You'll notice that he's commenting about all the tuition he had to sacrifice to afford. I comment that the tuition at the Stanford Business School was $2,400 in 1970. Even if you multiply by 5, it was a bargain at the time.
Jeff, you may have to explain to them what a secretary was.
Oh, this is the one that I remember most forcefully. I would love to meet that student today and ask him if he's changed his mind. But these were the kinds of prejudices. There was lots of fascination from the Hollywood approach to computing. But when it comes to business school, the devil in the details and actually using them, it was often a different story. And that's going to be part of what we will be presenting today, were some of the hurdles that we had to deal with in introducing computers to largely the MBA students and less so for doctoral students and in research. The framework we're going to use is based roughly on decades. We're going to break it down, and each of us will be contributing. And as I say, it's unlikely, given the time constraints, that we're going to make it up to the 2000s. But we're going to emphasize the first 3 decades because that's probably of greatest interest to you. And so we're going to start by talking about the GSB's entry into use of computers beginning in the 1960s. And so here are the details, and the 2 people who were most involved in that are here is Chuck Bonini and Jerry Miller. Bill Sharpe and I came on the scene a bit later. So let me turn it over to both Chuck, who was the first person, I think, here hired by the business school and began using computers long before the GSB even had its own technology in-house.
Well, as Jeff said, when I came, there weren't really any computers here at Stanford, and I had done my dissertation work on a computer at Carnegie Tech, and I wanted to extend it to do some other things, and there weren't any ways I could do it. Ultimately, I got, essentially, it was done in these punch cards, which you may have seen of or heard of anyway, and basically I ended up essentially mailing them down to UCLA and getting the things mailed back from UCLA, and extended that work that way at the very beginning. So that's computers at Stanford, but using UCLA at that point. I taught statistics in my early years most of the time. Those of you all taken that. And one of the interesting things, if you look at that, there are a lot of computations and so on, but one of the most important tools that you get out of statistics is regression. And that involves calculating sums of squares and cross products and working it all out. So if you've ever looked at the formulas in let's say, the statistics book, here's my copy of the book I did with Bill Spur. Basically, it's got the calculations. For simple regression, it's not too hard to do by hand, and you can do that. But if you get into multiple regression, then you have to solve systems of simultaneous equations. And that gets very complicated. First of all, it's complicated to add up the numbers because you have to get sums of squares and cross products. And we did have here some calculators that made that worthwhile. You could actually get sums of squares and cross products on a hand calculator. It wasn't a computer, it was just a calculator. Pardon? It was a Marchand. Okay. And so then basically the idea of that taking those equations and solving them was a very major task. So that the use of computers, that once we got into there, that was a first and very most important use of computers, was essentially to get in and use regression, understand it, be able to add it, model it, et cetera, to do that. We did do that on the computers, the first computers that we had here that were mentioned. And I think that was the one that used this tape here. Is that right?
No, that was used later on the HP 2000.
Well, okay. Yeah, but in any case, we did do that and maybe later. Maybe I'm getting a little bit ahead of it, but essentially, here's the equivalent to the cards that we had as tape that was running the program. And in fact, I wrote a program for our computer here to do multiple regression because there wasn't one on it. Later on, of course, there were ones that you got on. In fact, I'll talk later on, is we used various software packages to do that.
Well, I think Jerry is the one who's most familiar with what I guess we should politely call the IBM 1401 fiasco. It was our first acquisition. It was a donation, as I recall. Is that right, Jerry?
IBM.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it came in 1962, and as far as I know, it mostly gathered dust. Is that correct? I think maybe one or two faculty members made some use of it.
Chuck Bonini and Dan Tycrow. The only two that I know of.
And this was a second generation business machine, primarily oriented to back office accounting and invoicing and things of that sort. It was not really, didn't have the capabilities to offer much in the way of computing to students. It was essentially batch processing oriented, so there was limited access to it. And I don't believe it was ever made available to students in any classes, if I'm correct on that. The other use was, as you see there, the central campus computer, which later became a 360, and still later with the first computer lab that I believe Jerry was heavily involved in about 1968, in which we installed 15 remote access terminals that allowed time-sharing access remotely to the central machine that was over on the other side of the campus. Did you have anything to say about that, Jerry, about particularly how students grappled with the triage that was required, because there was 15 machines to serve multiple sections of, let's say, a core course that involved 350 or so students. And so you were given 1 hour time slots to try to get your work done.
It was a nightmare. The first computer course was taught by us. First computer course for us was taught in the fall of 1968. It was a core course called Business 250. It was called Management and the Computer, and it was taught by, not by me, I started in '69, by Bill Massey and Norm Nielsen. And there were 15 2741, IBM 2741 terminals that went to the computer center, as Jeff said. And we taught that course in the fall. The first 6 weeks, they were taught basic programming. And the last 4 weeks, they were taught modeling, mostly modeling management problems and things, and some information systems, which were in late 1968, pretty much in their infancy. Students were given an hour in which they could have access. You'd sign up for a 2741 and you'd have your hour to do basic programming and whatever else you wanted to do. That course was exceptionally unpopular when it was first offered in 1968. It was sufficiently unpopular so that Norm Nielsen decided he didn't want to teach that course again. The trouble was, in 1968, we had no computer faculty. There were no faculty members in the fall of '68 who were 100% computer people. We had just, by vote of the faculty in the fall of 1967, decided to introduce a new field called CIS, Computers and Information Systems, to be introduced in the fall of '68. And when you introduce a field at the GSB, that means you create a core course, it means you hire faculty members, and it means you have some second-year courses, and you establish a PhD program. So that was what was decided. But it was not implemented. There was nobody here in the fall of '68 to kind of do that based on having been here for a while. Bill Massey was drafted from marketing, Norm Nielsen from what we then called Operations and Systems Analysis, OSA, and they put on the first course. I told you about its less than well-received experience. I was drafted, I was hired to teach organizational behavior, and I was drafted in the fall of 1969, and Bill Massey and I put on the second version of that course. I think the best thing that we can say is it was very much like the first. It was 2741s time shared to the computer. We didn't have our own computer yet. And 6 weeks of basic programming, 4 weeks of management modeling, management information systems, and so forth. And I think the best thing that I can say was that we were supplanted as the least popular core MBA course only by marketing. Which in the winter quarter, but we came back later, got our rightful place. Anyway, those were difficult times. It wasn't, we didn't really get started until 1970, which is when Bill Sharpe joined us, and we got our own computer, and I'll let Bill talk about that. But we didn't start being a real computer group until about 1970. So I'll stop here and turn it over to Bill, who came with, he was the first computer czar, and he was the one who essentially put our HP 2000C on track, and personally spent God knows how many hours developing a PERT, which he hand-coded, PERT chart for the SEP 1971 SEP program. And he can talk about that experience if he still wants to.
I don't remember the PERT chart, but I do remember the SEP. I'll tell you about that.
Let me interrupt. I've got a few photos.
Okay.
I'll turn it over to Bill. There is the punch card. Computer graphics was done with printed characters, as you can see. The 2741 terminal looks like a regular typewriter. There were no integrated circuits. It was all discrete logic. And the desk underneath was full of electronics. It was an extremely expensive terminal at the time. There is the 360-67 that was used. It looks rather small, but in fact, there are many, many boxes back here constituting that machine. This was the abortive attempt at the 1401 that was ultimately returned to IBM for lack of use. And you can see it's actually quite small machine, even by the standards of that day.
I should add one quote, because you have your kind of quotes. This was an administrator, a top administrator at the Graduate School of Business, who when the 1401 was sent back because we didn't use it, was asked, well, why don't you have it in your curriculum? And in 1965, we didn't. And his response was, well, we don't teach typing at the business school, so we don't teach programming either. Just as an interesting little quote.
Well, as you see there in the 1970s, there was a big shift. And the subsequent finance expert was actually a computer-oriented person at the time that we attracted from UC Irvine to come. And I think czar is the correct word because he orchestrated the acquisition of an HP computer, one of the first ones they built outside of instrumentation use, but it was designed specifically to be used in business schools. And voluntarily took over the acquisition of it and the early management of the group. So I'll let him talk about what happened during that time period.
Well, thanks. I don't believe at the time I was called a czar. When I saw that on your slides when you sent them to me, I thought, I don't recall being called that or certainly feeling it. I had actually my checkered career when I was at the University of Washington. In addition to finance, I'd done a lot of computer things, set up a couple of computer courses, which I taught at the business school. So when I came here and I saw that we had 15 terminals connected to the IBM 360 on Central Campus, it seemed to me that there was a better way. And then my co-conspirator was a then young fellow in CIS named Hank Lucas. And we looked around, found out about the new HP machines. And so we engineered a lunch at the faculty club, I remember. Hank and R.J. Miller, our then dean, and R.J.'s not here, so I can make up, the dialogue. And we said, R.J., we really need to get this machine. We can have our own machine. It uses time-shared BASIC, which is a language even MBAs will love. We were wrong on that, as you can imagine. And we ought to have that. And R.J. said, fine, how much does it cost? And we told him whatever it was. The original machines I've looked up cost $90,000. Then at some point it was down to $50,000, but it depended on the configuration, et cetera. And R.J. said, well, I can probably get HP to give us one or to give us a big discount, but don't worry about it, I'll get you one. Jerry was asking me how much we paid for it. I never knew, but the machine arrived, or we helped make it arrive. So we set up a computer center down in the basement of the building. We got teletypes, which were machines, big clunky things that were made for literally telegrams and such, and the storage medium on the machine, on the teletype, was punch tape. I'd had one in my bedroom at Irvine, so I knew about them. They were really noisy, so somebody steered us to a guy somewhere in Sunnyvale who made containers, big wooden boxes that you could put it in. So we bought those. And we put some number downstairs. Some of us had them in our offices, and they communicated using the phone, literally the phone. You take the handset, put it in this thing, and then your teletype would beep to the computer, and the computer would beep back, and that was communication. The ones downstairs were hardwired. And then initially we had no staff, so it was run basically, at lunch, RJ said, well, who's going to run this? And I looked at Hank, and Hank looked at me, and RJ said, well, Hank, you don't have tenure, so Sharpe, you'll be it. Fine. And I should have asked, well, do I get a reduced course load? But I didn't. But it was run basically by myself and Renee Hammerman, who was the administrative assistant for Jerry, myself, and you, I believe, yeah. And then we hired Don and Gail and Leroy. But initially it was run basically by Renee, and to say she was an administrative assistant gives the wrong impression. We were her administrative assistants. This was an incredibly wonderful woman. Became very close friends of my wife and I, and the Millers as well. So Renee and I got this thing going, ran it. Then we started hiring people. And I don't know if you want me to talk about how I used programs and computers in my courses. I can do that now. It was mostly in the 70s, not all. Again, I taught finance, not computers in any form. I guess I did a number of things. I wrote some routines in BASIC, which I managed to crack the code for Lotus 123, figure out how they stored the data. So I wrote some routines that would allow you to put your data, say for regression, into a spreadsheet, and then it would do its thing, and then it would make the program run, blah, blah, blah. And so we used that in my finance courses so people could do regressions and performance analysis and risk computations, the sorts of things I was teaching. And that was run initially, I think, on the 1401, not the 1401, hardly, on the 2000, and then subsequently on the DEX. Somewhere in the 80s, to fast forward, I did a couple of seminars, MBA seminars, in which the students, 12, 15, would set up an investment firm and have various jobs, but it was to be quantitative based. So I was the quantitative department, and by then I had a small version of the DEC machines called an LSI-11. Jerry had, probably still does, 2 or 3 or 4. And so when I taught that, I would bring my machine into my office, and then I would be the programmer. The students didn't have to program, but they did have to understand programming and quantitative methods. What else did I do? The SCP experience, the executive program, Alex Robachek was the director then, and he set up a sort of quantitative methods, operations, research set of sessions. I think the first year there were 5. I taught them, and I developed software for each one, and we had terminals up at the dorms where the executives were staying, and we made them do things, not program, but use programs. And then the next year, Alex had me teach 4 sessions, and then the next year he had me teach 3, and the next year I said, Alex, I'm beginning to suspect this is not working out. Why don't we just stop? And he said yes. So the executives didn't particularly like to run programs either, let alone program. So in any event, and I guess the only other course-related experience I will tell you about, I taught the corporate finance required MBA course one year to try to prove a point to my colleagues over some arguments we were having over the content. And in that course, I made the students learn to read, not write, but read some things in MATLAB, which is a matrix-oriented mathematical statistical language. And I thought that went pretty well, and my ratings were no worse than in some of my other courses, which is all I will tell you. Back to you.
Well, you see a picture there. What HP did was rededicate a small 16-bit mini computer, put one to handle input, output, the second to do the processing of the jobs, and then tape back up. And then there's a paper tape reader, and you see there on the terminal the paper tape that Chuck Bonini just showed you, and that's how students would store their programs to carry away with them because the allocation of disk space was so tight. Here is an example of a program, and again, I call your attention to prove my point about computer nerdiness. The author of the program is listed there at the bottom. And this did simple regression. And this was the kind of output you would create on the teletype. This is the actual run. This did 4 simple regression programs involving log transforms or simple regression. And there is the complete code. As you can see, it's kind of 2 pages. It's a lot of work, a lot of typing to be done to carry out just a simple regression. And it would be almost overwhelming to ask MBA students to do anything even as complicated as this, at least from scratch. And so we would often give out templates which they would then modify, things of that sort. We have almost no record of what happened at the GSB in terms of photographs and so on. And this is about the only picture we have of the GSB lab. A couple of things remarkable about it. First, it has the cover that Bill just mentioned because the cacophony was unbelievable. From the rattling teletypes at 11 characters per second, you couldn't talk over the noise. And so this was a sound deadening. Now the person using it looks a little old to be an MBA student. I suspect it was a member of one of our executive programs. But that look of utter frustration, all of us have experienced on multiple occasions throughout the years as part of our teaching.
Actually, that brings to mind one other thing. Fairly soon after we got the HP machine, I can't tell you the date, Tektronix, an instrument, lab instrument manufacturer in Portland at the time, came out with this really nifty device. It was like an oscilloscope, but unlike oscilloscopes that have to be refreshed all the time, you could write on it and it would remember, the screen would remember. We say, well, of course, you know, yeah, big deal. But at the time it was a big deal. And they were expensive. I think we paid $7,000 or $8,000 a piece. But RJ, I told RJ this would be really great. We can do graphics, interactive, and so he bought us two. So we had two of those, and then the executive experience with that, we gave a one-week course for financial industry people, investment people, et cetera, fairly high level. So I wrote a program. It was interactive. It would show you a graph of what had happened to something. I didn't tell you what it was, whether it was a stock or a portfolio, the price, week by week for 25 weeks. And then you got to play with it and go long or short, depending on what you thought was going to happen for each week for the next 25 weeks. And so each of them had to do this and then write a report indicating how much money they made or lost and what their strategy had been and what they thought the thing was against which they were playing. And then the ones who'd made the most money had to give a little presentation to the class. Now understand, these were fairly high-level investment professionals. And the presentations were wonderful. Well, I saw that there was a trend with a da-da-da, and there was a reversal with a, you know, head and shoulders, and we got all these explanations. And then I explained that it was all random number generators. And I mean, thank God that wasn't graded because, I mean, I earned the enmity of, you know, a large portion of the investment industry. So we never did that again. It was fun to program. But I made my point about random walks, I think.
Well, this was far more successful than our experience with the IBM remote terminals. And there was actually a group of business schools that got together to form an association, and we contributed faculty programs to be shared and so on. And I'm something of a pack rat. There were multiple volumes of this. This is how we documented things for students. They would be sitting there with paper. There'd be listings of the code. And students would read through this. Oh, that's interesting. There's a lease analysis program. So they would then go find it, read it in on the paper tape, modify it, and then run it. And that's kind of how we did things at that time.
I might say the first meeting of the business school users group for the HP 2000 was held in France at INSEAD. And I know INSEAD had one, Chicago Business School had one. So one of the perks of being a czar, to use your term, was I got to go to France. And some expenses paid.
We quickly topped out. One of the problems was we couldn't support 32 terminals, which was the maximum. There just simply wasn't enough computer capacity to support it. And so we immediately went back to the trough, which was R.J. Miller, our dean. And by this time I had arrived and had gotten involved in doing some of the teaching of the core courses. And we made a big pitch for him to get a much bigger machine. And that turned out to be from Digital Equipment Corporation there beginning in about 1976. And they had been very successful selling their technology to universities in particular, competing very successfully against IBM and a few of the remaining large company, Fortune 500 company competitors. And ultimately, Digital became the second largest computer company in the world. We bought a DEC System 2040. I've got a photo I'll show in a minute. It was a much larger time-sharing system, 36-bit. Why 36? Because initially bytes were 6 bits instead of 8 bits, as they later became. The university had purchased several of these machines, so we were able to leverage off the support infrastructure that was available elsewhere at Stanford. And as you can see, we upgraded it on multiple occasions and ultimately bought a second one. We named one of them How, because it was dedicated to teaching MBAs how to do things with computers. The second one was called Why, and that was dedicated for research and was used primarily by faculty. And you'll notice the count of CRTs. At that time, we moved away from teletypes, had grown dramatically to upwards of 200 as a total number. And we also began following closely what was happening in the homebrew computer club at the time, in which you saw hobbyist computers starting to show up. We didn't take it too seriously for purposes of teaching until a major seminal event occurred in late 1978, which was the release of VisiCalc, the first spreadsheet program, which turned out to be the killer app that justified many of these early 8-bit personal computers. We acquired 5 Apple IIs, and this made, the VisiCalc program made Apple a success. Surprisingly, we took a grant of donations of related computers, 5 of them from Atari, who later became a game company, but at that time they were selling personal computers. There's an interesting anecdote that we installed them in Jackson Library, and David Kelly, who founded IDEO, the design firm, now a professor in the D School, had a contract from Apple to design a tie-down because these personal computers were quite portable and could disappear. And there was great concern that because they fit neatly into a backpack, that they would walk out of Jackson Library, not via any of our MBAs, of course, but the library was open to the entire Stanford community. And so David Kelly and I spent a very intellectual afternoon with a 1/4-inch drill, drilling holes in tabletops and installing cables and screws and so on for these first tie-downs. So you can see some pictures here of the DEC System 20. It was noted for its very colorful orange cabinetry. Much, much bigger machine. There are the internals of it. As you see, it's floppy disk and a little mini computer for handling the input-output to support the terminals. And you see the pictures of 2 early entrepreneurs, Bill Gates and Paul Allen. They actually developed the basic language using a DEC 20 because they didn't have access to the personal computers that they were ultimately going to sell it to run on. And then they later used that program to create a company called Microsoft. We had converted to terminals like this, and this is the acoustic coupler that Bill mentioned a moment ago, running at 30 characters per second, using what was called a silent writer. Notice a dial telephone, which was common at the time, for access. And by the way, we all thought we'd died and gone to heaven with this kind of technology because it was so much better than the previous batch-oriented technology that we had. So these systems were very, very successful, both in our teaching and in our research applications. The one thing I will show, we purchased a language called Empire. Today it would be called a scripting language. And it was a high-level finance language that was used to create the equivalent of a spreadsheet. And I'll show you some of the code in just a moment. We thought conceptually it was perfect for teaching the modeling course. The students didn't think so. We always had trouble with this until one day it dawned on me that the reason the student enthusiasm was low was because they knew in order to export all these ideas into their careers, they would have to fight to create new infrastructure, disruptive infrastructure, in whatever organizations they joined, which meant buying Digital Equipment Corporation machines in a market that was dominated by IBM, and spending many hundreds of thousands of dollars making the conversion. What was so attractive about VisiCalc is students could graduate, they could take the software, and literally for a few $1,000s buy a machine that they could use anywhere in the world. And that, I think, was the huge barrier to entry that attracted students to personal computers. And certainly we had a similar experience here. The IT group internally, by then had grown quite a bit, were very much opposed to acquisition of these early PCs. Why? Because they considered them toys. And it took me a long time before it dawned on me that they had administrative rights. So they could do anything they wanted with the DEC 20s. So to them, here was a multi-million-dollar machine that was their own personal property. They could do anything they wanted with, so why would anyone buy the equivalent of a tricycle when you needed a Mercedes-Benz? So I show you some of the pictures that were relevant to that. This is Empire. The company was ultimately acquired by one of the telcos. And this was what we would call a scripting language. And as you can see, it's almost as compact as a spreadsheet would be. You would label the columns, you would define the stub entries, and it would automatically fill in all the cells. So it wasn't a spreadsheet, it compiled into a running program. And from a conceptual standpoint, the faculty thought this was more than sufficient. And of course, the students didn't share that for the reasons I've cited. This is what they wanted, which was an Apple computer running, and this is the early VisiCalc, no graphics, but you see the A1, B2, C3 cell notation scheme that became dominant very, very quickly. People would ask, how do I acquire VisiCalc? And the computer stores would say, oh, it's $3,000. And they would simply hand them an 8-bit portable computer, and people were happy to pay that price, not realizing that they were paying mostly for the machine, not for the software. By the way, the price of VisiCalc was about $250 at that time, multiplied by $5,000 to get a spreadsheet in today's money. We then began in the 1980s to make the major switch into personal computers. And as you see, we won't go through all the documentation there, but you can see there was a major advance into substituting personal computers for time-sharing systems of one sort or another. What was quite interesting is that we formed a committee. Collaborative decision-making was common here at the business school, just as Bill had done with Hank Lucas to get the HP 2000. Chuck Bonini and I were appointed to a committee to decide personal computers, what to do. And of course, we were going to enter, but the question is how? For example, should we require that students purchase their own personal computer and bring it with them? And if you recall, the price was on the order of 1 year's tuition to acquire a personal computer. So effectively, it would double the tuition of an MBA student in the first year. That was a rather threatening prospect. So we decided, well, we're going to have to provide them. But the question was, could we get grants? Do we somehow share access by a recharge system or the like? So Chuck and I contacted our counterparts at the Harvard Business School. And they had formed a committee to look into personal computers. And although we compete fiercely for MBA students in admissions between the two schools, We also compete in the hiring of faculty between the two schools, but in some dimensions we share. For example, case clearing is done by Harvard because there's scale economies that they get that we can't match. So we flew to Cambridge. It was my first trip to Boston, and I was stunned. We had one building at the time. If you visited the Harvard campus at that time, they had 21 buildings across the Charles River that constituted the Harvard Business School. And we met with our counterpart faculty who were also looking into what to do about it. We were taken to lunch at their faculty club, and I was introduced to the dean. Unfortunately, we were going down the buffet line, and so we couldn't carry on much of a conversation. We got to the cashier, and he paid, and I began paying for my lunch. And he turned to me and he said, "This is very important. We need to make creative use of personal computers, and this transition is going to be quite a challenge. And with a budget of $16 million, we should be doing a better job." And I didn't have a chance to make an utter fool of myself by responding because we were paying for our meal, but I went back to the table where Chuck was sitting and the other faculty were sitting, and I commented. I said, "I am really impressed by the Harvard Business School. We have one building, and our total budget was $10 million. Harvard has 21 buildings, and their budget is only 60% higher at $16 million. And I thought, what an efficient operation. The faculty just howled. And they said, "No, you don't understand. Our budget for personal computers is $16 million, which exceeded the entire budget of the business school by 60%. So although most people think of us as equals, in fact, it's always been a David and Goliath story. What was interesting, the final conclusion was, and I think it reflects, at least at that time, the two cultures view. We focused on functionality and said what we want is computing technology for students with a basis in analytics, decision support, and interactive use, hands-on in our teaching, and similar support for faculty in their research. So we said it's going to be spreadsheet. We didn't name vendors. We said it's functionality that counts, not the logo on the terminal or the PC. Harvard announced their policy. They selected IBM above all others, and they selected IBM division, not Boca Raton, which is where the personal computer division was headquartered at the time in Florida. They selected the division that produced word processing systems. And so their commitment to personal computers was to produce word processing documents, whereas ours was to do analysis. And I think that was quite a stark difference between the two schools at the time, reflecting their various biases. In any event, we made the commitment to VisiCalc. What you'll notice is that, let me go back, you'll notice that a program called NCPCalc, we hired a local programmer, a hotshot water walker programmer, and he produced a 100% clone of VisiCalc on the DEC 20, on the DEC 20 using CRTs. So that allowed us to launch into use of spreadsheets without having to spend.
It did crash, actually, if you use commands for VisiCalc.
Well, yes, we're kind of, yeah, we're looking with rosy glasses, of course. But it worked much better than I thought. And it was successfully used to introduce spreadsheets. We later, of course, then segued into the use of computers involving VisiCalc, and then later in the 80s, we moved into what ultimately became Excel. One of the decisions we made, because our budgets, we were lean and mean as a business school, and I somewhat regret, is we decided to go the route of grants. to get the machines donated because there was a huge interest in supporting MBAs with this new technology as basically a marketing tool from these companies. The problem with that is it delayed us by about a year or maybe a year and a half in actually getting the technology because we had to write the grants, particularly from IBM donations. Anyone who's ever dealt with IBM, their lawyers are legendary. Things like intellectual property rights and things of that sort. Who owns the software that the faculty would produce using these donated computers and so on and so forth. But we ultimately were successful in that, and as you can see, many, many computers were acquired, personal computers at that time. The typical one was a so-called 8088 and later versions of the Intel processor. The Macintosh itself was a failure, total failure, partly because it didn't have a spreadsheet. And partly because it didn't handle large documents. We were very interested because the documents supported technical typing with Greek letters and subscripts and superscripts and other things that faculty research papers would use. But unfortunately, it simply didn't have the horsepower or the capacity to do anything more than a 3 or 4 page document. And a typical faculty research paper is more like 20 pages long and so forth. But that changed over time, and as you'll see, we ultimately got many more Macintoshes as their functionality improved. Chuck, in particular, was a big fan of a donated group of computers we got from HP called the HP 150. Did a lot of work with that. Later, we got larger workstations using 286 machines. Notice those prices. Multiply by 5, you get a rough idea, absent Moore's law, what those machines were costing us at that time. Extremely expensive machine. The HP Vectra at $8,000 in today's money was $40,000 each by comparison. Here is an ad for what the innovation was on the HP 150. Touch screen. You could touch your finger and move things around and so on and so forth. 30-some years ahead of Apple's invention of that product and their devices much later. The product failed. Developers did not pick up on it and develop application software. And so we ended up using it basically for VisiCalc. Later, we got workstations from IBM. We made a big commitment to Macintoshes for administrative use, particularly for technical typing and the like. And then later these machines became much more capable as Apple expanded their product line in the 1980s. One of the big advances that we had was from a product from a company called Citrix. And what they created was the ability to emulate an IBM Windows session on a dumb terminal or even on a Macintosh. And this greatly facilitated our teaching. So for example, students could have a Macintosh computer but could run Windows-only software on it without having to have a separate applications package. And that was extremely useful. It's since been discontinued here, but it was very, very popular at the time. And as you see, we acquired and began to make our move into the web-based applications. As I mentioned, the IT staff, particularly the director at that time, a lady by the name of Sandy Lerner, very much opposed to any of the PC applications. And it finally came down that we had a fight, and she reported to me. By this time, I was the CTO with a half-time appointment for this, keeping a half-time appointment as a faculty member. And I finally had to sit her down and say, look, the decision has been made. It's been vetted by the deans and multiple committees. We are moving into PCs. The DEC 20s are going to be retired. And you're either going to have to climb on board with this decision or you're going to have to leave. And she didn't make up her mind right away, but she ultimately walked out in a huff. The irony is that she and her husband founded a company called Cisco, which ended up producing networking technology that would tie together all of personal computers. And she became a many hundreds of millionaire person, even though she was totally opposed to the whole technology, at least initially.
Let me see,
Yeah.
I would have some of those fights with her as well. She was without a question one of the smartest people I have ever met. She did just a spectacular job running the center, but you guys had one direction with which I concurred. I bought one of the first IBM PCs, and Sandy felt very strongly, but it worked out okay for her.
Yeah. One of the reasons that she was successful here in other dimensions is she had a master's degree in statistics, which very few IT managers had, and so she was able to communicate with faculty on supporting their research projects and the like, which turned out to be extremely helpful. What happened later in the 1980s is that the market became extremely competitive. IBM lost its monopoly power. Clones became the norm. New companies like Dell and the classic beige box clone PC became the norm. Margins fell dramatically. There were no longer big grants. You had to buy the machines and the like because it shifted. But you'll notice that MBA students, there were lots of PCs installed. We also had a simulated disk drive on a central machine for shared work called the M drive. And students were allocated all of 35 megabytes of storage for their personal use, plus another 20 megabytes for email and calendaring and things of that sort. Again, by today's standards, this would only take a small percentage of a USB memory stick. But this was major allocations at the time. Later, we began shifting into using the university systems for more of the web services and the like in the 1990s, and began acquiring Apple iMacs, colorful machines that were quite popular because they would run Citrix for those courses that use Windows software, but otherwise Excel was available. And we had more or less standardized on Microsoft Office and Excel as the spreadsheet. These are the typical beige boxes that constitute the use of the computing at the time. Here are some pictures of the actual internal networking that was used. The first network used what we called thick Ethernet. This was how we tied machines together as a party line. 3 megabit transmission rates, and the way in which you attached the computer to it is you would install a box, an interface box on the cable that cost about $500, and then you would run a cable from that down to your PC board. This is from 3Com, which you would connect. Notice there's a 16-bit processor. This card for networking alone was about $1,000 at the time, and so it was extremely expensive to do things that we take for granted today. It was very difficult to install because the business school building at the time had not been designed for any of this sort of thing. We had concrete floors, so we actually had to thread this through the air conditioning system and the heating system that was installed there in the school. Later, you see some remnants of that here, but what you see is these blue cables go down to the PCs themselves. The backbone by the 90s had been replaced with optical fiber, and you see it's all Cisco system stuff now that became the routers. That was their cash cow, and how we had converted even then in the 1990s for that kind of a distribution. The other vendor that we made heavy use of was Sun Microsystems, co-founded by two of our graduates. Their servers were extremely popular during the internet bubble in the 1990s, and we acquired quite a few of those. We acquired down here, these are actually some Windows NT servers provided by Hewlett-Packard. And the cold room basically became a collection of servers and web-based applications at that time. Well, we're running tight on time.
Welcome to Computing at Stanford's Graduate School of Business. You have 24-hour access to our Student Computer Lab, which has more than 100 NT workstations equipped with zip drives. You'll find a help desk as well as assorted printers, scanners, and Palm Pilot cradles. Drop-in help is available, and you can also schedule appointments for remote access assistance. For any other problems you might experience with your personal computer, check with the help desk for a referral to another service provider. The Student Computing website is a great resource that includes answers to frequently asked questions and provides links to documentation and other useful sites. You can also contact the IT committee, your fellow advocates for student computing issues. Another computing resource available to you is the Sun Technology Experimentation.
Now this lab I created, called TEL, for Technology Experimental Learning Lab. We had a lot of entrepreneurial interest by students who wanted to do startups that the venture capitalists would support. We have a faculty member in the back of the room, Dennis Rohan, who was teaching a projects course at the time. And I remember he said, well, we've taken over Arbuckle Lounge to set up projects, and a bunch of venture capitalists are coming. And the students will be to talk about the projects with the venture capitalists. I said, that's a great idea, Dennis, because then the students can show what they've created in the TEL lab. And he said, no, you've got it wrong. The venture capitalists have so many projects that they have approved, they're desperate for managers. So they're coming with the projects in the hopes that they can attract some of our students to go to work for them. So you can see times have changed somewhat since that time. The TEL facility.
SunTel provides a working laboratory for students and faculty to explore new technologies, offering consulting resources and state-of-the-art equipment, including Unix and NT.
I took over some of the leftover servers, and this was a cold room to which we gave students access so they could do server-side programming to develop projects for their startups that they could test out. We also had video conferencing and PageMaker for document desktop publishing. The big investment, which turned out to be a disaster, was editing, video editing. The dominant system then was Avid, and it was designed for feature-length Hollywood movies. And it took about 6 sessions before a student could begin to do anything at all. We had to pay $100 an hour for consultants to come in to teach the students. This later changed dramatically when Apple announced Final Cut, and students could be productive on a Macintosh doing video editing in about 20 minutes. It was a major advancement, and you'll see, whoops, sorry, oh, I hit the wrong key. In any event, there's a video editing station there at the end of the video that shows students developing video clips and so on for their web pages and the like. Well, we've used the time that we've allocated for kind of giving you this overview of at least the first 4 decades. And what we'd like to do is throw it open to some interactive question and answer from anyone in the audience who would like to ask a question. This is directed to Chuck Bonini. He wanted to know what was the early research using computers. What were some of the early research projects used by faculty which use computers as part of their research?
I'm not
I think
sure.
any of the 3 of you can comment.
Yeah, I don't know. No, go ahead.
Well, see, I did there at one point. The school bought tapes. They were tapes. One from CompuStat, which had financial data on corporations, earnings, etc. The other from CRISP, Center for Research and Security Prices, University of Chicago, which had very, very high quality data on security prices, dividends back to 1926. And so there were a lot of research projects by faculty. The one that I particularly remember, well, there were several. but one I did with an MBA student named Guy Cooper, which did a lot of data processing and resulted in a publication, and then a subsequent one with Blake Grossman, then a student who ended up managing the biggest index funds, I guess, in the world. That was about South Africa divestment. The other one was about testing various models of security price formation. So those were big projects, and they involved a lot of data. And the one with Blake was at a happier time technologically than the one with Guy. But the school paid quite a bit of money for those two key databases, and I was only one of many finance faculty using the CompuStat and the CRISP databases. A lot of research in finance at a very important time in the field was done using those databases, and we were right there with them, our faculty.
We had one story I can tell is related, involving the DEC 20s. And we had two faculty members there, young assistant professors who were going for tenure and trying to do seminal research using financial data from sources such as CompuStat. This was Mark Wolfson, who is no longer here. He's emeritus, but Jim Patel is still here, and both of them were going for tenure. And we made a deal with them. We would shut down time sharing at midnight so that students could not have access and turn over the DEC 20 to them. They were looking for relationships between information announcements and its effect on stock prices. How quickly would the information be embodied in shifted stock prices? And we called them the Space Twins. Sandy Lerner was the director, and she said, the Space Twins have used up all the hard disks again. You've got to go and talk to them. They have to cut back their work. And of course, I knew that was a foolish thing to even attempt. This is an example of what they were doing. This was the disk pack, 300 megabytes. Wow. And you would screw it down with a screw on the top of the disk drive. And little vacuum cleaners would come out and clean the disks, and then the heads would jump out, and they would have 300 megabytes of financial data that they could access with a database to test their theories about the relationship of information to stock prices. And like a father with a child, I take credit for Jim Patel's and Mark Wolfson's success subsequently here at the business school. Do you have any other questions?
No. Do you want me to do that?
Yeah, I do.
Oh, okay.
I don't know if they do, but I do.
My favorite activity, research activity, started, as far as computers are concerned, well, it actually started at MIT before I came. But in Stanford, it started in the mid to late 70s. And I thought it would be kind of fun to build a personal computer. Remember, this is 1976, 77, and personal computers were not then extant. I think the Commodore PET, which you got in Christmas of 1976, was one of the first. He was one of the first, and that was run on audio tape, as I remember. That was the major input-output device, audio tape. It was awful. Anyway, I thought it would be kind of fun to build a personal computer, and I called it my serious machine. Serious because it was more than a toy or a hobbyist. And it was based originally on a PDP-11, an LSI-11, which was the only thing I could afford to buy with my own money because the school was not interested in financing this project. So in December of 1981, I had a two-user, two-job time-sharing system built on a PDP-11. In June of 1982, it had expanded to an 8-user, 16-job time-sharing system on a slightly bigger, this was now the 1123, not the 1103 processor. Then it later moved to a VAX engineering workstation. I would say that that was probably the most serious thing I did in my life. I mean, it was kind of my life's work was building this thing. And I still use it. Nobody else does, of course. But I still use it. Since I retired from Stanford, which was 1995, the last 18 years I've kind of changed my field. I do cancer research. And this machine has been quite central, all the programs that have been written to do medical research in cancer, mostly melanoma and breast cancer. So that was my thing.
I can tell a few stories, not related to research, but related to the teaching that you might not expect. Remember I said people were blank slates and had obvious misconceptions about computing. And so when personal computers were introduced, here's how it would work. You would have floppy disk drives. Some of you probably remember these kinds of floppy drives on the original personal computers. And these were often attending executives coming to Silicon Valley to participate in our short programs, a 2-week program or 8-week program in the summer, which we made a lot of money doing to offset the losses on our MBA program. The problem was that more than 60% of them had English as a second language. And so when you would write instructions, you had to be very precise with your semantics. And I remember I was conducting a brief exercise. And you would start out by saying, to log in, type your username and hit return on the CRTs. And I remember watching the lab as the executives would type their name very carefully and hit return. And so the next year I rewrote it and said, type your name and carefully depress the enter key. And so they would press the enter key too slowly. And that would trigger the auto-repeat function inside the computer. And so it would generate 50 or 60 carriage returns and error messages because the password was blank and so on and so forth. And so then I had to type a whole page of how to type your username and how to depress the keys. I knew we were going to have troubles because the procedure was you would boot up with DOS, that was one floppy disk. You would then remove that floppy disk and install a Lotus 123 disk and load Lotus 123. You would then remove that disk and put your data disk in that contained your spreadsheet and the data and so forth. And I said, this machine has one floppy, there are 3 disks, this is going to be troublesome. We better have some teaching assistants present to take care of this issue because people are going to simply get confused, particularly if they misunderstood the semantics of my tutorial. And I remember many of the reasons that CEOs would come here is because they could afford to ask dumb questions that they could never do in their home companies because of face loss. But they could do so here. And I said, be prepared, and by no means should you react the normal way with laughter or condescension, because that would destroy the relationship here. And sure enough, I had an executive from a Fortune 100 company come to me and say, it's just not working. And I said, oh, really? What's happened? Well, let me show you on the machine. So I went to the machine, and here was the floppy drive with about 16 floppy disks stuck in. He had taken all 3 and jammed them in, and nothing had happened, so he checked out 3 more and jammed those in, and so the disks were fanning out. And I knew better than to laugh, or I thought, what is going on? What could possibly be the metaphor or worldview that would cause a person to do that? And I said, but you never have thought of that. Doesn't this look like a mail slot? And that was the metaphor. You put your floppy disks in, they pile up inside the machine, and then little electronic automatons come out and shuffle the disks around internally and do their magic to create images and so forth on the screen. And so that was the thought. not realizing that they had destroyed about 10 copies of Lotus 123 at $300 a piece, because the licensing was the floppy disk itself, and of course destroyed the floppy drive itself. And so having to kind of sit down and explain these issues to novice users during these early years was a huge burden. Fortunately, people's knowledge has now become pervasive, and we need to devote almost no time to those kinds of things today, and we can jump much more quickly into the conceptual things that we want to cover as part of our courses. One consequence of this is that, for example, the introductory courses have been shortened. They used to be 4-unit courses. Now many of them are 2-unit courses because we have saved these startup problems as Moore's Law and people's knowledge has come up to speed.
One other anecdote on that. It's a little off message, but I happen to be opposed to spreadsheets. I think spreadsheets are the spawn of the devil, but be that as it may, I believe everybody should learn how to actually program. And I now teach a summer course for 12-year-olds in computer programming, and it's just amazing what these kids know how to do. They don't know how to program. They know all the mechanics of computers, all the rest of that, and they know a lot about animation, etc. So I believe, I'm sure it will have no more effect now than it did when I argued it all those years ago. I believe everybody, and that would include MBAs, ought to really learn how to program in some reasonably serious programming language. Doesn't have to, not BASIC preferably, but something of that sort, if, then, but, loop, subroutine, whatever. It's just, I think it's good for your mental health and the way you think about the world. So, and so that's just my philosophy. I've said it so many times in this and other business schools. I'm sure it's falling on deaf ears as it has before, but my 12-year-olds are doing a great job.
3 of us agree with you. We're all sitting here.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's right.
That may be a
And
census.
none of us is employed anymore here, if you'll recall.
Do you have any other questions? Well, thank all of you for coming. I hope you found the panel to be a useful review of how we got to where we are today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.